Please comment where you're watching from so we can see that our Soul Stories family is truly all around the world. Boston always had a kind of rain that made people feel smaller than they really were. Not the kind that flooded streets or drenched umbrellas, but the kind that fell like fine silk, persistent, whispering, sliding down cafe windows and vanishing as if it had never existed. Ella Monroe sat in the corner of that cafe, a cold cappuccino in front of her, and a stack of sketch drafts smudged with ink and rainwater. She had sent out dozens of portfolios over the past 3 months, yet no one replied. Boston was cramped, expensive, and indifferent to young dreamers clinging to art. Each time she opened her inbox, there was another polite rejection. Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with another candidate. At 27, Ella had a degree in landscape painting, a sharp eye, and undeniable talent, but talent didn't pay rent. Her tiny apartment barely fit a bed, an easel, and a few plants slowly dying for lack of sunlight. Outside, the city blurred beneath the drizzle. People hurried by, coats flapping, umbrellas tilting. Ella rested her chin on her hand and doodled a wilted flower on a napkin. She had once dreamed of owning her own gallery filled with bright, tender landscapes that pulsed with life. But that dream felt more and more distant. A soft thing from her laptop snapped her out of thought. A new email appeared in her inbox, subject line, Employment Offer Vance Holdings Art Foundation. The name tugged at her memory. Vance Holdings had once funded several art projects across the East Coast before quietly disappearing after a tragic accident 5 years earlier. She clicked the email and read slowly, Dear Ms. Monroe, we represent the Vance Holdings Art Foundation. The restoration project of the late artist Clara Vance's garden and studio, located at Hawthorne Estate, Vermont, is in need of a landscape painter. You have been selected based on your online portfolio. Compensation, $90,000 for 3 months of full-time work. Confidentiality terms, must reside on the estate during the project. No contact with the press or third parties. No leaving the premises without permission. If you agree, please visit the office of Attorney T.R. Carver, Boston, to sign the contract before 6 p.m. today. Ella reread the message twice. $90,000 for 3 months? It sounded unreal, especially for a struggling freelance artist barely scraping rent. But the conditions made her hesitate. What kind of art project required that level of isolation? She opened a search bar and typed Clara Vance Hawthorne Estate. Dozens of old articles appeared. Tragedy in Vermont, promising artist dies in car accident. One photograph showed Clara Vance, a blonde woman smiling brightly amid a rose garden. Beside her stood her husband, Gabriel Vance, a celebrated architect who had disappeared from public life after her death. Ella stared at the photo for a long time. A gifted couple, a garden buried with its memories. She leaned back in her chair, heart racing, and wondered, why me? Why now? That afternoon, she went to the office of Carver and Associates, an aging brick building on Tremont Street. Attorney Carver was a tall man in his 50s, sharply dressed but with weary eyes. Ms. Monroe, he greeted, shaking her hand with a voice that carried the weight of years. Thank you for coming so quickly. The Hawthorne project is quite particular. He slid a thick contract toward her, the pages still smelling of fresh ink. These terms seem rather restrictive, Ella said carefully. Carver nodded. The owner demands absolute privacy. He doesn't want the media to be aware that the project is happening. The owner? She asked. Mr. Gabriel Vance. The name made her pulse slow. He still lives there? He never left, Carver replied softly. But don't worry. He won't interfere with your work. Mr. Vance simply wants the garden restored to what it was during his wife's lifetime. Ella hesitated, pen hovering over the signature line. Then she signed. Her hand trembled slightly as the ink dried. 3 months, a lonely mansion, a past that hadn't been buried, and her just one artist chasing a chance. 2 days later, the rain returned. Ella's silver rental car cut through the wet highway, leaving Boston behind as she drove north toward Vermont. The skyline faded into fog, replaced by maple forests and fields shrouded in mist. The radio played an old jazz tune, its notes curling like cigarette smoke. When she saw the weathered wooden sign on the roadside, Hawthorne Estate Private Property, her heart skipped a beat. The narrow road wound between two rows of dripping trees, the air thick with the scent of rain and moss. She stopped when the iron gates appeared, tall, ancient, streaked with rust and moss. A small sign read, "No trespassing." Ella stepped out, gripping the cold metal bars as she peered through to the other side. Beyond the fog stood the mansion, its windows dim and lifeless, its steep roof bowed, its porch coated with dust. Somewhere inside, the wind moaned through broken shutters like a sigh that never ended. She drew a long breath, pushed the gate open, and drove in. Gravel crackled under her tires. The rain thickened, pounding on the windshield as the estate came into view. Gray stone, tall pillars, vine-carved railings, split and broken. It was magnificent, but cold, like a dream that had once lived and been buried too soon. Ella turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, heart racing. Through the blur of rain, she could almost feel someone watching from one of the dark windows. Not fear, something else. A quiet knowing that this place held too many things left unsaid. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, whispered to herself, 3 months, Ella. 3 months in a garden that needs to live again. Then she opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and walked toward the mansion, toward her dream, and perhaps toward her destiny. Hawthorne Estate wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that made a person hear their own heartbeat. As Ella stepped through the grand foyer, the only sound came from her wet shoes against the marble floor. The air smelled of old wood, paint dust, and dried flowers, all mixed into something faintly nostalgic, the scent of time locked away. An older woman appeared at the end of the corridor. Her hair was silver but neatly tied, her back straight, her eyes sharp. "Miss Monroe." "Yes, that's me. I'm Margaret, the housekeeper here. Mr. Vance will see you now. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." Her voice was raspy but without malice. She turned and led the way down a long corridor carpeted in black, her heels striking the floor in steady rhythm. On both sides, covered paintings lined the walls, white sheets draped over frames like shrouds for dreams long abandoned. They stopped before a pair of heavy oak doors. Margaret knocked softly. "Sir, Miss Monroe has arrived." Silence. A second passed, then another. Finally, a low male voice came from within. "Come in." The door opened. The office was spacious, with high ceilings and walls filled with architectural blueprints. A large window overlooked the gray garden outside. A man stood by the desk, his back to her, tall, broad-shouldered, sleeves rolled up, his suit jacket resting on the chair. The cold light from the window outlined him, shaping every movement with restrained power. When he turned, their eyes met steel gray, still and piercing, as though nothing in the world could surprise him anymore. Gabriel Vance. Ella swallowed. She had seen his photo in old magazines, but in person, he carried something impossible to define, a mix of elegance and danger. His features were sharp, the faint shadow of stubble tracing his jaw, his lips pressed tightly together as if every word cost too much to speak. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice low and rough, like metal brushing against flame. "I don't care for formal greetings. You were hired to restore Clara's garden. Start as soon as you can." "I understand," she replied. He studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I have 2 rules." "I'm listening." "First, I hate noise. If you need to sing, talk, or play music, do it somewhere else. Second, I hate curiosity. There are doors in this house that you don't need to open. Leave them closed." Ella felt her chest tighten. "I'll respect that." Gabriel sat down, signed a few papers, and set his pen aside, a silent cue that the conversation was over. "Margaret will show you to your room. The project lasts 3 months. If you need materials, ask her. Don't come to me." He didn't look up again as she left the room. The corridor returned to its heavy quiet. Margaret walked ahead, the keys at her waist clinking softly. "Is he always like that?" Ella asked, trying to keep her tone light. "For 5 years now," the woman replied. "Because of Mrs. Vance?" Margaret glanced over her shoulder, an expression that was part sympathy, part warning. "Don't mention her name in front of him, Miss Monroe. Around here, even memories have ears." She opened the door to Ella's room on the 2nd floor, overlooking the lake. The space was clean and simple, but cold, as if untouched by warmth for too long. "Dinner's at 7. The master usually eats alone. You can use the small kitchen downstairs." "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret," Ella said with a small smile. "Have you been here long?" 32 years. "And he's always lived here?" "Always." The woman paused, then lowered her voice. "He used to be the brightest light in the city. Now he's just the shadow of it." With that, Margaret turned and left, closing the door behind her. The only sound left was a steady patter of rain against the window. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the cracks, and branches scraped the walls like whispers. She put on a coat, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to take a walk through the garden, the place that would soon be her work. The back door creaked as she pushed it open. The wind hit her face, damp and heavy with the scent of rotting leaves and wet earth. The flashlight swept across what was once described as the soul of Hawthorne, and her heart sank. The garden was a ghost. Rose bushes had dried to black, their branches brittle as bone. The pond at the center was drained, the bottom crusted with mud and fallen leaves. Marble statues were cracked. An angel's head had fallen off and lay half buried in the soil. Creepers climbed the walls, choking every path. Ella stepped carefully, the beam trembling in her hand. The silence was so thick she could hear water dripping from the eaves into the dry pond. Somewhere in the darkness, the wind circled through the trees, carrying a sound that almost resembled a sigh. She knelt, pressed her palm to the ground. It was cold, damp, yet there was still life underneath. A single blade of green sprouted timidly through the dead soil. Ella smiled faintly. At least something still wants to live. A faint light flickered from the window on the second floor of the room where Gabriel slept. He was standing there looking down at the garden. She lifted her gaze. Their eyes met through the rain, only for a few seconds, but it was enough. In that moment, Ella saw it clearly. This man wasn't cruel. He was a soul that had wandered too long in the dark. The light in the window went out. Ella rose, staring up at the sky, the clouds thick and heavy above her. "We'll bring this garden back to life," she whispered to the wind. The breeze brushed through her hair, carrying the faint scent of ash and rain. And somewhere in the stillness of the Vermont night, Hawthorne seemed to exhale a quiet, broken sound, like the breath of someone who once knew how to love. Morning in Vermont was wrapped in mist, and Hawthorne Estate lay beneath it as though time itself had forgotten the place. Ella stood in the middle of the neglected garden, sketchbook in hand, eyes lifted to the bare branches above her. Dew dripped from the leaves and dampened the collar of her sweater. The air smelled of decaying earth, wilted flowers, and old wood. Yet instead of feeling dreary, she found it strangely beautiful, like stepping into an unfinished painting, waiting for someone to bring its light back. She started with small things, sweeping the mossy stone paths, pulling weeds around the drained pond, and noting where the old plants used to grow. Margaret assigned her 2 helpers, Peter, an elderly gardener with kind eyes, and Liam, a shy young man who spoke little but worked hard. "What do you plan to plant first?" Peter asked, leaning on his shovel. Ella smiled and turned a page in her sketchbook. "Roses. They used to be the heart of this place." Peter shook his head. "The heart's been dead for years, Miss Monroe. The roses stopped blooming the day she died." "Then we'll plant a new heart," Ella said softly. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were steady enough to silence him. Within days, the garden began to stir again. Barrels of compost appeared, packets of seeds, trellises for vines, and rows marked for replanting. It looked less like a graveyard and more like a workshop for hope. From her window, Margaret often paused to watch, shaking her head but not without a faint, reluctant smile. 10 days later, when the sun finally rose behind the mountains, Ella came out earlier than usual. She wanted to trim the dead rose branches before replanting the new ones. Dew still clung to the thorns, glittering like threads of glass. She put on her gloves, bent down, and hummed an old Nat King Cole tune she'd heard on the radio. Her voice was light, barely more than a breath in the morning air. Then her heel slipped on a patch of wet moss. Everything happened too fast for her to react. She gasped, arms flailing, until a strong arm caught her from behind, pulling her upright. She looked up and met Gabriel Vance's storm-gray eyes. The distance between them vanished. She could hear his breath against her neck. His shirt was damp with dew, his hand gripping her arm firmly, but it trembled. "Careful," he said, voice rough and low. You planning to become the next tragic headline of this estate? Ella exhaled, forcing a calm smile. Sorry, I didn't realize how slippery it was. Gabriel released her and straightened, his expression shuddering as though the brief moment of closeness had never existed. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around the small scrape on her wrist. I don't want another accident here, he said slowly, but there was a pause in his voice, a crack she could almost hear. She looked up at him. You say that like you've lost someone to one. He froze. For half a second, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, but pain. A deep, dried-up kind of pain that had been buried too long. Get back to work, Miss Monroe, he said quietly, his hand tightening for just a moment before he turned away. And don't ask questions like that again. He walked off toward the stone corridor. His posture was straight, composed, but his fingers twitched slightly, as though the tremor inside him hadn't quite subsided. Ella stood where he left her, heart unsettled. The garden was quiet again, filled only with birdsong and the scent of wet soil. Peter appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a cloth. He came out here? Yes, she said. He seems afraid of something. Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. He's afraid of losing someone else. Mrs. Vance died in a car accident 5 years ago. Since then, no one's been allowed to touch a thing in this garden. You're the first. Ella said nothing. She looked down at the broken rose stems scattered at her feet, and in that silence, a thought crossed her mind. Maybe that's why his hands were shaking. At noon, she ate lunch with Margaret in the kitchen. The air was warm, filled with the smell of toasted bread and mint tea. Does Mr. Vance ever go out? Ella asked. No, Margaret replied. Not since the funeral. What about his family? There's no one left. His parents died young. Mrs. Clara was everything to him. The older woman poured more tea, her tone softening. Some nights I hear him talking in the studio, sometimes laughing, as if she's still there. She placed her cup down, eyes distant. But don't mention that, Miss Monroe. At Hawthorne, we don't stir the past. The past here knows how to answer back. Ella nodded, glancing at the woman's weathered hands. I just want to help the garden live again. Then do it, Margaret said quietly. Maybe it's been waiting for someone to try. By late afternoon, a fine drizzle began to fall. Ella returned to the garden alone, gathering piles of dead grass and planting a few lavender sprouts near the pond. She worked until dusk, her hands muddy, her face streaked with sweat. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the veranda, half hidden in shadow. Gabriel stood there, leaning against a column, silent. He didn't speak, just watched the way she moved, steady and patient, humming softly as she worked. The sight stirred something unfamiliar in him, something he hadn't felt in years, a breath of warmth, maybe even peace. When a breeze lifted the hem of her coat, revealing the bandage he had tied that morning, his eyes lingered on it. The sight made his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something he had forgotten how to name, concern. By the time she finished, brushed off her hands and turned around, he was gone. Only the scent of rain-soaked wood lingered in the air, and the faint glow of a window upstairs reflected in the puddles. Ella looked up at the roses glistening with raindrops. For the first time, she felt the garden breathing again. And somewhere behind those cold stone walls, she could almost sense the man within, taking a breath too shallow, uncertain, but undeniably alive. Rain began at dusk and went on until midnight. The wind pressed hard against the windows of Hawthorne Estate, making a low, steady sound like the breathing of someone lost in a dream. Ella lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, and every flash of lightning illuminated the room for a heartbeat, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. She was just pulling the blanket closer when a sharp sound cut through the night glass, shattering somewhere above her. Her heart tightened. For a few seconds, she stayed perfectly still, listening. The rain was heavy, but between its rhythm came another noise, a faint clatter, followed by uneven footsteps, like someone had dropped a bottle and stepped through the shards. Ella threw on her sweater, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped into the hall. The mansion at midnight felt like a sleeping giant. Every sound echoed against its ribs. The wooden staircase creaked beneath her weight, and the flickering beam of her flashlight swept across the cover portraits. their draped shapes standing silently like ghosts on guard. The sound led her to the end of the second-floor corridor to a door painted black, one that was always kept locked. But tonight it was slightly ajar. A gust of cold wind pushed through the gap, making her light tremble. She nudged it open. The smell of strong whiskey and old paint hit her, first thick, raw, and bitter. It was Clara Vance's studio. A single desk lamp burned weakly, its glow falling over a large easel in the center of the room. The canvas was unfinished, the upper half a pale blue sky, the lower still blank. On the floor beneath it were a few dried paintbrushes, a spill of dark red stains that might have been paint or not. On a nearby shelf stood a framed photograph of Clara in a white dress, smiling with radiant joy. Ella froze. In the middle of the room, Gabriel sat slumped in a swivel chair, head bowed, a half-empty bottle beside him. The light revealed the exhaustion etched deep into his face. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disheveled, his hands streaked faintly with old paint. He didn't look at her. His voice came out rough, like the sound of someone who had been talking too long to ghosts. "She left because of me." Ella stopped in the doorway. "I said things I can never take back," he continued, his voice breaking. "God, if I had just kept quiet for one more minute." He tilted his head back and gave a short, hollow laugh. "But I don't know how to be quiet. I always had to be right, always had to have the last word." And then, he gestured helplessly into the air, as if the storm from that night still swept through his hands. Ella stood silent. She wanted to step inside, but something in the air, something sacred, broken, untouchable, held her still. It felt as though if she crossed that line, the whole room might collapse. Leaning against the doorframe, she spoke softly, just loud enough to be heard over the rain. "Maybe she's already forgiven you, Gabriel. The real question is, have you?" He lifted his head. His gray eyes met hers, filled with fury, shame, and fear all at once. "You don't know anything about it. I know sometimes people survive loss," she said quietly, "but choose to bury themselves anyway." Gabriel rose abruptly, his anger flaring not from cruelty, but from defense. "Get out! Gabriel! You're not allowed in this room!" The shout rang through the hall, echoing off the walls and clashing with the sound of rain outside. Ella didn't move. Her gaze stayed steady, filled not with defiance, but with quiet compassion. "All right," she said softly. "I'll go. But you should know sometimes forgiveness isn't for the dead. It's for the ones still living." She turned and walked out, closing the door gently behind her. The click of the latch was faint, like metal brushing bone. Inside, Gabriel stared at the unfinished painting, his fist clenched until the tendons showed, his breath ragged and shallow. On the desk, Clara's photo tilted slightly, catching his reflection in the cracked glass, a distorted image of the man who couldn't let go. He exhaled, but it wasn't really a sound, just a cold gust of air leaving his chest. Out in the corridor, Ella leaned back against the wall, her pulse quick and uneven. Her hands were shaking not from fear, but from heartbreak. The house seemed to fall silent again, the rain tapping gently on the roof like an old melody. She looked up toward the ceiling, where his voice had just broken through the years of silence, and whispered to herself, "At least he said half of it. Someday, he'll say the rest." Back in her room, Ella lit a small lamp, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw the black painted door, the faint line of light escaping from beneath it, like the soul of something that still refused to rest. That night, Hawthorne Estate lay deep in the rain once more. But this time, within the weight of the wind and water, there was something fragile, something barely audible, like the first breath of a heart that had been forgotten, learning slowly how to live again. The rain had stopped by morning. Drops of water still clung to the leaves, glittering like glass as they caught the thin light of dawn. Ella sat in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the misted window. Margaret moved quietly behind her, preparing breakfast. The scent of toasted bread and fresh coffee mingled with the faint sound of a spoon stirring. The kitchen door opened. Gabriel walked in wearing a gray shirt, a white envelope in hand. He didn't look at either of them. He simply placed the envelope on the table and said in a calm, measured tone, "For you." An addendum to the contract. Ella lowered her cup and stared at it as though the envelope itself carried a chill. An addendum? Yes. Some necessary boundaries after last night. His eyes flicked briefly toward her, cold as the surface of a morning lake. She tore the envelope open. Inside was a single printed page, no more than 3 short lines. Additional clauses. 1. No questions about Mr. Vance's past. 2. No entry into the upstairs studio. 3. No mention of Mrs. Clara Vance in any form. At the bottom was his signature, sharp, controlled, decisive, like a blade cutting through still air. Ella looked up. You really mean to turn your past into something forbidden? The past, he said flatly, is meant to be left alone. And you think if you forbid people from speaking of it, it'll stop existing? Gabriel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was frosty. You're a gardener, not a therapist. I hired you to plant flowers, not to dig up graves. She smiled not out of bitterness, but with the kind of calm that unsettled him. You can stay silent as long as you want, Gabriel. But don't expect this garden to stay silent forever. A faint, sardonic smile ghosted across his lips. You think life will return here just because you believe it will? No, she said, taking the pen and signing her name. The black ink bled slightly into the paper. I know it will because I still believe in light, even when others don't. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. It wasn't warmth, not yet just a fragile spark, enough to stir something dormant. Gabriel turned away, picking up the envelope again. His voice dropped low. Fine. Do as you like. Just don't touch me. Then he left, the faint scent of pine and cologne lingering in the air after him. For a long time, Margaret said nothing. She wiped the counter, then finally murmured, He isn't cruel, you know. He just doesn't remember how to live with people anymore. I know, Ella said softly, but if he keeps locking every door, one day he'll suffocate inside his own house. The older woman looked at her, something bright flickering in her weary eyes. You're different from the others. They all left after a few days. Because they were afraid? No, Margaret replied, smiling faintly. Because they saw nothing left to save. And you? What do you see? I think, the housekeeper said, turning toward the window, the garden never really died. It's just been waiting for someone patient enough to stay. By noon, sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, glinting on the wet stones of the path. Ella rolled up her sleeves, picked up a spade, and began clearing the weeds around the pond. Peter and Liam worked beside her, hauling soil and compost. No one talked much, but there was laughter quiet, genuine, the sound of metal scraping earth, the gentle rhythm of renewal. From the second-floor window, Gabriel stood watching. He leaned against the frame, coffee cup in hand, eyes following her as she moved across the garden. She was unlike anyone who had ever come here before, unafraid, unhesitant, unpitying. She worked with life, with color, as if every seed she planted was a small act of defiance against grief itself. Peter said something that made her laugh, and that sound carried through the open window like sunlight breaking through clouds. Gabriel looked down at his hand. A faint red stain still marked his finger from the paint in Clara's studio. His grip tightened around the cup, and for a fleeting second, he realized his hand was shaking. By late afternoon, Ella had finished a small section of the garden. The first lavender plants stood in neat rows, their scent drifting lightly on the breeze. She wiped her forehead, looked up at the clearing sky, and smiled. In the distance, through the tall windows, she saw Gabriel still standing there. She didn't wave or speak, she simply went back to her work, pretending not to notice him. And yet that unspoken understanding hung between them, as real as the soft hum of wind through the leaves. When evening came, Ella sat at her desk with her sketchbook open, the lamplight spilling over the page as she wrote in delicate script. The contract of silence isn't meant to suppress sound. It's to test whether trust can speak in its place. She smiled faintly at her own words. Then from somewhere deep within the house, a sound reached her faint at first, almost uncertain. Piano. Ella looked up, listening. The melody drifted through the hallways like breath, hesitant, uneven, but unmistakably alive. She rose and stepped into the corridor just to be sure. Yes, the music came from Gabriel's study. He was playing. The tune faltered here and there, as if his hands had forgotten how to touch the keys. But still, it was music raw and fragile, the sound of a man remembering what it meant to feel. Ella closed her eyes and let the notes wash over her. Perhaps, she thought, no contract could silence what was meant to be heard. Like life itself, music always finds its way through even the hardest walls. And that night, in the mansion of a man who had once feared the sound of his own heart, for the first time in years, something began to sing again. The wind began in the afternoon. Heavy clouds rolled down from the northern mountains, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and iron-gray mist. Thunder rumbled somewhere far away, low and steady like the growl of an approaching beast. At Hawthorne Estate, storms always made the house look as though it might collapse inward on itself, devouring its own silence. Ella was in the library when the lights went out. A sharp pop echoed through the air, and everything was swallowed by darkness. She startled slightly, setting her book down. Outside, thunder roared again, long, guttural, like brass horns announcing an unseen war. Wind battered the windows until the panes quivered. "Margaret?" she called softly, but no answer came. The mansion seemed to be holding its breath. She groped along the bookshelf, found an old candle in a drawer, and struck a match. The flicker of light trembled across the spines of books, throwing long, restless shadows on the walls like ghostly figures whispering to one another in the dark. Ella sank back into a worn armchair, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw by candlelight. Rain drummed overhead in a steady rhythm, the sound blending with the hiss of wind sneaking through the cracks. And then, without meaning to, she began to hum. Just a quiet tune, half memory, half instinct, the soft, timeless melody of Unforgettable. Her voice was untrained but warm, filled with something fragile and human. The sound drifted upward, gentle and raw, touching the stone walls and echoing back, as though the house itself was listening. The library door creaked open. Gabriel stood there. He carried no flashlight, only the faint glow of the fire behind him, casting an amber halo across his shoulders. His shirt was damp from the rain, and droplets slid from his sleeve, splashing onto the wooden floor. Ella looked up, startled. "You're here?" "The power's out." His voice was low, rough-edged but calm, yet his gaze on her wasn't calm at all. It was the look of someone seeing something they weren't sure they believed. "What were you just singing?" "An old song," she said softly. "Clara used to love it, didn't she?" He stopped. For the briefest instant, his face changed. A small, fragile crease appeared near his temple. Not of anger, but of memory. He stepped closer, pulled out the chair opposite her, and sat down. The candlelight played over his face, half caught in the glow, half lost in shadow. "You know that song?" he asked. "I heard Margaret play it on the radio the other day," she replied. "It's sad. Beautiful, but sad." Gabriel's eyes dropped to the fire. His voice was almost a whisper. "I used to think music could make people stay." "No," Ella said gently, her tone certain. "Music doesn't keep people. It keeps the best parts of them." He looked at her then, slowly. "The best parts?" "Yes," she said. "When we can't speak, music speaks for us. When everything else leaves, music is what remains." For a long time, they sat in silence. The fire popped quietly in the grate. Outside, rain poured like 1,000 steady heartbeats. The candle wavered, its flame stretching, bowing, recovering. Gabriel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced. "You're not afraid of silence?" She shook her head. "No, I'm afraid of people who use silence to hide from life." He stared at her longer than before. The flickering light caught in her brown eyes, tiny sparks glowing against the darkness. There was something disarming about her presence, the way she didn't push, didn't pity. She simply stayed. "You're strange," he murmured. "Maybe," she smiled faintly, "but maybe that's what this garden and this house needs." A gust of wind slammed against the window, making the candle flicker violently. Ella instinctively shielded the flame with her hand. The light flared again, and for the first time she saw his eyes clearly. They weren't as cold as she had thought. They were tired old, wounded, and devastatingly human. He didn't leave. They sat there, two figures enclosed in the rhythm of rain and fire, their silence no longer empty but full of what hadn't yet been said. He, a man who had lost everything. She, a woman who still believed life could bloom from ashes. Time stretched thin like melting wax, and in that quiet, something shifted. A fracture appeared in the wall he'd spent years building, small, invisible, but enough for light to slip through. Later that night, when Gabriel finally rose from the chair, he paused at the doorway. Behind him, her voice rose again, not unforgettable this time, but something wordless, something she made up on the spot. It was soft, almost like a lullaby, meant not for him but for the house itself. He placed a hand on the wooden railing of the staircase. The banister was cold beneath his fingers, but for the first time, he didn't feel the emptiness he was used to. He felt longing, not the painful kind that crushed, but the quiet kind that reminded him he was still alive. When he reached the landing, he turned once more toward the library. The fire was still burning, and its reflection trembled along the stone walls, old, cracked, but still standing. And in that reflection, Gabriel saw not the ghost of a dead woman or the ruins of his own guilt, but something startlingly alive. A man beginning, just barely, to remember how to breathe. That night, Hawthorne Estate did not echo with sighs or silence. It hummed with something new, a melody that began with the voice of a girl who believed in light, and lingered in the quiet gaze of a man who was learning, at last, to hear it. Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands of listeners and sharers come together. That morning, sunlight filtered through the leaves like thin golden threads, scattering across the garden in gentle glimmers. For the first time in years, Hawthorne Estate no longer looked lifeless. The lavender Ella had planted was budding pale purple. Wild roses had begun to climb the wooden trellis again, and laughter, bright, human laughter, echoed across the courtyard, a sound the house hadn't heard in a very long time. "No, Liam, you're drowning them." "Flowers need a drink, not a bath," Ella called out between bursts of laughter, shielding her eyes from the sun. Margaret stood on the stone steps, watching her with a mixture of astonishment and affection. "You've made this dead place remember how to smile, Miss Monroe." Ella winked. "I'm just helping it remember how to breathe." The laughter carried across the garden, light and infectious. On the second-floor balcony, Gabriel stood still, one hand resting on the cool stone railing. He hadn't meant to stop, but the sound caught him mid-step, that laugh. Light, unguarded, with a rhythm almost identical to Clara's. His fingers tightened on the rail. For a moment, a single impossible moment, he saw at Clara's hair catching sunlight, her head tilted back in laughter as she brushed the soil from her hands. But then the light shifted, and it was only Ella standing there, brown hair tangled, cheeks flushed, her hands covered in earth. His chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar. He stared for a long time, realizing only when his breath grew uneven that he had forgotten how to breathe without pain. That night the sky was calm again, but inside him a different kind of storm had begun to rise. Gabriel opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for years, the same one he and Clara had shared during their last dinner together. The first sip burned down his throat, bringing with it the bitter taste of memory. Ella's laughter from earlier replayed in his mind, merging with Clara's voice until he could no longer tell them apart. Two echoes, overlapping, one of the living, one of the dead. When the wine was half gone and his pulse began to quicken, he rose to his feet. His heart, heavy with something wild and dangerous, led him down the hall. Ella was in the library jotting notes about the plants they'd reintroduced to the soil. The door flew open, carried by the wind, and with it came the scent of rain, alcohol, and something else, a restless energy she couldn't name. Gabriel stood in the doorway. His hair was disheveled, his shirt collar open, his eyes red yet startlingly clear. "Gabriel?" she said quietly, but he didn't answer. He stepped closer, voice rough and low, trembling at the edges. "Why do you keep doing this?" "Doing what?" she asked, uncertain. "Making me believe she's still here," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. walking through this house as if nothing was ever broken, laughing like her, talking like her, making me forget that I'm the one who, he stopped, swallowing hard, the one who killed her. Ella rose from her chair, heart pounding. You're drunk. No. He shook his head, eyes dark and glassy. I've never been more sober. He took another step forward. The space between them shrank until she could feel the heat of his breath. You don't know what it's like, he whispered, to watch the person you love die because of words you can never take back. She didn't move. The pain in his voice cut through the air, raw, desperate, human. There was nothing cruel in it now, only the ache of a man who had been buried too long under his own guilt. I'm not her, Gabriel, Ella said softly, her voice trembling but steady. But you're punishing everyone who tries to help you breathe again. He gave a broken laugh, the kind that hurts to hear. Breathe? I stopped breathing the night she died, Ella. Everything since then has just been pretending. Then stop pretending, she whispered, stepping closer. Her eyes shone with something fierce and gentle all at once. Stop living like a sentence you wrote for yourself. The air between them thickened. Wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Gabriel stared at her, really stared as if seeing her for the first time. Years of grief and silence, fear and longing, collided in that one look. And then, without a word, he reached for her. His hands trembled as they found her shoulders, pulling her closer until she could feel the tremor in his chest. His breath was uneven, heavy with wine and sorrow. The kiss happened like lightning sudden, unplanned, born of everything they hadn't said. It wasn't gentle, nor was it hungry. It was desperate, clumsy, achingly real, the moment when two broken souls stopped pretending they weren't alive. Ella didn't pull away. Her heart pounded against his, her hands caught between them. For a brief, trembling instant, the world outside disappeared. No ghosts, no guilt, only the fragile warmth of two people who had forgotten what it meant to be touched without fear. When he finally let her go, neither of them spoke. The silence between them pulsed with something that wasn't emptiness anymore. You can't keep living on guilt, she murmured. She wouldn't have wanted that. His voice cracked when he answered. You don't understand. Forgiveness. That's the hardest thing in the world. No, she said quietly, not forgiveness. Starting again. For a long moment they stood there, the storm outside echoing the storm within. The candlelight trembled between them, throwing gold across their faces. At last, Gabriel stepped back. His eyes softened, exhausted. Go get some rest, he said, voice low. I shouldn't be here. He turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy but his heartbeat for the first time in years fast and alive. When the door closed, Ella stayed where she was. Her lips still tasted faintly of salt, his tears, maybe, or her own. She walked to the window. Rain still fell, but far on the horizon, lightning flashed pale and fleeting, the first hint of a storm finally passing. And somewhere deep within the old house, where hearts had long forgotten how to beat, the first crack had appeared, small, fragile, but enough for light to find its way in. The next morning, Vermont's sky was startlingly clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush of sunlight that spread gently across the damp stones of the courtyard. The garden glistened as though it had just been washed clean of its sorrow. Yet inside Hawthorne Estate, the air was thick, dense, and brittle, like a string pulled too tight, waiting to snap. Ella rose earlier than usual. She washed her face in cold water, tied her hair neatly, and forced herself into motion as if order could steady her heart. As if the night before had never happened. As if that kiss, trembling, real and full of pain, had been nothing but a dream swallowed by rain. Gabriel didn't come down for breakfast. Margaret said he was occupied in his study and had requested not to be disturbed. Ella only nodded. She didn't ask questions, but his image lingered in her mind anyway. His eyes, his hands, the broken sound in his voice when he'd said her name. It's fine, she told herself. Just work. Let the silence speak for you. She worked harder than ever that day, cutting, trimming, watering, sketching, moving constantly, as though momentum alone could drown out thought. She even cleaned the moss-covered wall she had once decided to leave untouched. Every movement became an escape. Peter and Liam noticed the change. You all right, Miss Monroe? Peter asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. I'm fine, she said quickly, though the smile that followed didn't reach her eyes. They exchanged glances but said nothing more. Gabriel didn't appear all day. Only once, when Ella was gathering dried grass near the pond, she thought she saw him standing by the upstairs window still, expressionless, a silhouette against the fading light. His gaze lingered for a few seconds before the curtain fell, erasing him once more. By nightfall, Ella couldn't bear the silence any longer. She climbed the stairs and stopped outside his study. Light seeped faintly through the crack under the door. She hesitated, then knocked softly. Gabriel? May I come in? No answer. She turned the handle. He was standing by Clara's old easel, his back to her. The lamplight fell across his face in halves, one side sharp and shadowed, the other pale and weary. On the table sat an unfinished glass of wine. Ella drew a quiet breath and stepped closer. If you regret the kiss, she said calmly, you can just say so. I don't need an apology, only honesty. He turned slowly. His gray eyes were darker than usual, clouded like the lake at night. I don't regret it, he said, voice rough and deliberate. Then after a pause, softer. I kissed you because I didn't know how else to stop thinking about you. Her heart clenched. The way he said was not accidental anymore. It was the truth, bare and unguarded. But then his voice trembled, carrying the weight of years. I'm not ready, he admitted. Every time I feel something good, I remember her. And it feels like betrayal. Ella's lips curved into a faint, aching smile. Gabriel, you're not betraying anyone. You're just living, and living again isn't the same as forgetting. She took a step closer, her voice steady and gentle. It's how they live on through you. He looked at her for a long time, something weary and broken flickering behind his eyes. It's easy for you to say, he murmured. You don't know what it's like to wake up every morning and remember you're the reason someone isn't alive. No, she said quietly, but I know what it's like to see someone alive and watch them punish themselves as if they were already dead. Silence settled again, deep and delicate. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock. Gabriel exhaled, turning away. You should go back to your room, Ella. I don't want to say something I can't take back again. She didn't move. The only mistake you keep making is believing you don't deserve forgiveness. His brow furrowed. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to defend his pain, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he whispered, You don't know what I've done. She shook her head softly. I don't need to know. I'm not here to judge, Gabriel. I'm here to remind you that beauty still exists, even if it's small, even if it hurts to look at. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped and said quietly, Tomorrow I'm planting another row of lavender by the pond. If you'd like, come see. They'll bloom by the end of the month. He said nothing, only watched as she disappeared through the doorway. When the door closed, Gabriel stayed where he was. His fingers brushed the rim of the wineglass but didn't lift it. He turned toward the window. Outside, the garden glowed faintly under the lamplight patches of gold on dark soil. And there, half hidden by shadow, he imagined her figure small, patient, the embodiment of quiet persistence. That night, neither of them slept. Gabriel sat in his study, listening to the wind move through the trees. Ella, in her room, wrote in her sketchbook by candlelight. He fears the light, but the light keeps finding him. From that day on, they never spoke of the kiss again. They didn't mention it, didn't look directly at each other for too long, didn't touch. But whenever they passed in the hall or met by the garden path, something invisible tugged faintly between them, a thread, thin as air, clear as glass. It had no name. It didn't need one. It was the thread between two hearts that had once been broken, learning, slowly, how to beat in time again. That night, Vermont was eerily quiet. The moon hid behind a veil of clouds, its pale light spilling softly over the garden that was, little by little, coming back to life. Inside the studio, Ella sat before a large, unfinished canvas. The strokes were soft purples and shades of tender green lavender and new beginnings. She hadn't yet named the piece. She couldn't, not until she knew how the story would end. The door opened quietly behind her. Gabriel? He stood there wearing a dark shirt with the top button undone, his hair slightly tousled, his expression drawn and heavy, as though he had been carrying something for too long. His eyes gray, tired, searching looked like they had finally reached their limit. "I need to say this," he said, his voice rough, so low it almost broke. "If I don't, I'll die with it." Ella set her brush down. She didn't speak. She simply waited. He stepped inside, stopping beside the canvas, his gaze fixed on the streaks of lavender. "Clara used to sit like this too," he murmured, "the night before it happened." There was a long pause, the kind that made the air feel fragile. He inhaled slowly, his fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the table, as if holding on to a memory that was slipping away. "The night she died," he began, "we fought. It was small at first, stupid, but I turned it into something unforgivable." His voice cracked, each word scraped raw. "Clara, she was about to have her first solo exhibition. I should have been proud, but instead I felt threatened. She said she wanted to be independent, to make a name for herself without being known as the wife of Gabriel Vance, the architect." He gave a bitter laugh. "Do you know what I said to her?" Ella shook her head silently. "I told her, if you want to leave, then go." The words came out like a confession carved from stone. He laughed again, a sharp, broken sound. "And she did. It was raining, and I let her drive. I stood at the window and watched her headlights vanish down the hill. 5 minutes later, someone called. He stared at the floor, unable to look up. They said the road was slick, that the car skidded off the ridge. But I know better. I know it was me. I pushed her out into the rain, into that night." The air went still. Ella could hear her own heartbeat, slow and heavy. Gabriel's shoulders trembled. "I've lived inside that moment for 5 years. Every time I close my eyes, I see her. Every time it rains, I hear the brakes scream. And I think, if I died, maybe then she'd forgive me." He gave another short, hollow laugh. "But I didn't die. I just kept breathing a body without a soul." Ella stood and crossed the room slowly. She didn't speak at first. She only looked at him, this man she once thought too cold to feel, now shaking like a child lost in his own past. Then she raised a hand and gently placed it against his cheek. "Clara's gone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not. Don't let that same night take you too." Gabriel closed his eyes. The first tear fell, landing on her wrist, then another. He didn't sob, just breathed unevenly, the sound deep and ragged, like something long frozen, finally beginning to melt. Ella didn't move. Her hand stayed where it was, her presence steady and wordless, a quiet space where grief was allowed to breathe. He grasped her wrist, not hard, just enough to keep himself from falling apart. "You don't know how long I've waited for someone to say that," he murmured. "No one can save you," she said gently, "except you." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was full of life, with the slow rhythm of healing. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting a golden glow across the room, turning the lavender hues on the canvas into something warm and tender. Gabriel looked up at it. "Lavender," he whispered, "the color of hope." Ella smiled faintly. "And of forgiveness once it stops hurting." He met her gaze. The walls around him, the invisible ones, seemed to falter. For the first time, there was light in his eyes, faint but unmistakable. The light of someone who had finally put down a burden too heavy to carry any longer. He exhaled, long and unsteady, the kind of breath that belongs to the living, not the haunted. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't thank me. Thank her. She left the best parts of herself in you, Gabriel. You just had to find them again." He looked down, silent for a moment, then whispered, "Maybe tonight, I finally started to live again." Ella nodded. Outside, the wind stirred the young lavender stems. Inside, two souls stood in the shadow of a woman, long gone, not trying to erase her, but carrying her forward in a gentler way. And when Gabriel turned away, tears still glistening on his cheeks, Ella knew this was not the end of his sorrow, but it was something greater, the first real crack through which light could finally pour. That morning, Vermont awoke as if exhaling the first breath of spring. Dew glistened on the lavender leaves, catching the sunlight like threads of crystal. Ella carefully loaded her final painting into the trunk, the Garden of Second Chances. It was more than a canvas. It was the story of this place, of its people, of the man who had learned how to breathe again amid the ruins of his own heart. She paused at the foot of the stone steps and turned to look at the Hawthorne mansion one last time before leaving. Gabriel's silhouette appeared at the upstairs window, a cup of coffee in his hand. His posture was calm and composed, but his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to carry something unspoken, caught between wanting to reach out and fearing to try. Ella smiled and lifted her hand. "I'll be back this afternoon. You still owe me a cup of tea in the new garden." He nodded once quietly. "Drive safe, Ella." She smiled again, then climbed into her car. The silver-blue sedan rolled down the driveway, fading slowly into the mist that still clung to the morning hills. The road to Burlington wound along the base of the hills, bright under the thin sunlight that followed last night's rain. Ella turned on the radio, letting soft music blend with the hum of the wind. For the first time in years, her heart felt still, not empty, not afraid, just full. On the passenger seat beside her, the painting was carefully wrapped in brown paper and labeled, "For Exhibition, the Garden of Second Chances." She glanced at it, a faint smile curving her lips. "We did it, Gabriel," she whispered. "The garden is alive again. And so are you." A flash of light cut across her vision, sudden, sharp, blinding. The screech of brakes, a metallic shriek, then nothing but white. Impact, glass shattering, air crushed from her lungs, and silence. By noon, the sun hung high above the Hawthorne estate. Gabriel was reviewing new blueprints in his study when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it until something instinct or dread told him to answer. "Mr. Vance, this is St. Mary's Hospital. Miss Ella Monroe was involved in a car accident. She's in emergency surgery." The rest of the sentence dissolved into the crash of a porcelain cup shattering on the floor. Gabriel froze, the color draining from his face. His breath caught, his hands shaking. "No," he whispered. "No, not again." He said it once, then again, and again, until it became a desperate prayer. He snatched his keys from the desk and ran, the door slamming behind him as the wind swept through the empty hall. The road to Burlington had never felt so endless. He drove like a man possessed, the tires screaming across the wet asphalt. Rain began to fall again, light, then heavier, as though the sky itself remembered that other night, 5 years ago. The trees blurred past. The world narrowed to a tunnel of motion and panic. His pulse thundered in his ears. Not again. Not this time. He didn't see the signs, didn't feel the distance. Only that mantra, "Don't lose her. Not again." At the hospital, he burst through the doors like a storm. "I'm Gabriel Vance," he said, his voice breaking. "Where is she?" "Ella Monroe car accident." The nurse at reception saw the desperation in his eyes and immediately pointed. "Third floor, surgery ward. She's in the operating room." He ran up the stairs down the corridor until he reached the glass window of the surgical suite. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly inside, white coats blurring under the harsh light. The beeping of monitors echoed through the hall like hammer blows. Gabriel gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. The memory struck like lightning, Clara in the rain, the headlights vanishing, the scream of tires, and he pressed his forehead against the cold wall, his breath coming in gasps. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. "She's in good hands," said a doctor quietly. "Wait here." He nodded, but the word wait felt like another form of torture. Hours passed. The corridor emptied. The rain outside softened into a steady whisper. Then at last the doors opened. The surgeon removed his mask, weary but calm. "She's stable. Weak but alive. If she rests, she has a good chance of recovery." Gabriel didn't wait for the rest. He could barely hear over the rush of relief that nearly knocked him to his knees. "Can I see her?" Moments later, he sat beside her hospital bed. Ella lay motionless, pale as the sheets. A small bandage crossed her forehead, and her lips were dry. Machines hummed softly around her, each beep a fragile proof of life. Gabriel reached for her hand. It was cold and small in his, but it was there. He clasped it tightly, his own palms damp. He couldn't tell whether from sweat or tears. "You told me to learn how to live again," he whispered, "and now you leave me halfway through the lesson." He bent his head, pressing his lips gently against her hand. His voice shook. Please, Ella, wake up. If you open your eyes, I'll believe in everything you said. I'll believe that love doesn't have to be guilt. He stayed there for hours, not moving, watching every rise and fall of her chest. Outside, night settled over Burlington. The rain pattered against the windows like a quiet heartbeat. Gabriel sat in the dim light, still holding her hand, whispering to her as if she could hear. Don't leave me in the rain again. Not this time. I won't let you go. And there, in that sterile hospital room between fear and faith, between guilt and grace, Gabriel Vance, the man who had buried love beneath his shame, finally understood what his heart had been trying to confess all along. He didn't want a life made of silence anymore. Not if it meant living it without her. 3 days passed at St. Mary's Hospital, and Gabriel lived like a shadow. He barely moved from the sterile white room, never slept, and barely ate. He sat beside her bed in silence, her small hand enclosed in his, the last fragile thread tying him to the world. Each time a doctor entered to check her vitals, he lifted his head with desperate hope, only to sink back into quiet when the answer remained the same. Sometimes, he whispered near her ear, his voice rough with sleeplessness. You told me to believe in life, in light. But what's the point of light if you're not in it? Outside the window, Vermont bloomed under the early spring sun. The fields were alive, the air crisp. The lavender at Hawthorne Estate must have begun to open by now, he thought. But the woman who brought them back to life lay still, silent, with the rhythm of her heart borrowed from a machine. At dawn on the third day, when the first gold light slipped through the blinds, there came a sound small, fragile, but real. A faint, trembling breath, as though a dream were finding its way back to the world. Gabriel froze. He leaned forward, barely daring to breathe. Ella? Her lashes quivered, then lifted slowly. Her eyes soft brown and hazy with light met his. Gabriel. The word was a ghost of a voice, thin but clear. He let out a strangled breath and reached for her hand, gripping it tight. You're awake. Thank God, Ella. His voice broke, and before he knew it, his forehead was pressed to the back of her hand. His whole body trembled as though 3 sleepless days, 3 days of fear, guilt, and prayer were collapsing all at once into this single shattering moment. I'm here, he whispered hoarsely. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him, her lips dry but her gaze gentle, warm like sunlight after rain. You haven't slept. I couldn't, he said softly. I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, you'd leave again. Just like before. Her head moved faintly from side to side. No, Gabriel. I came back. When the doctor entered, he blinked in surprise at her recovery. Miss Monroe, you're remarkably strong. 3 days in a coma, and your heart never once faltered. Ella's lips curved faintly. Because someone was keeping it beating for me, she murmured, her eyes turning toward Gabriel. After the doctor left, silence filled the room again, a quiet that no longer felt cold. Gabriel sat down beside her bed, still holding her hand as though letting go might unravel the world. Do you know something? He began, his voice shaking. I haven't prayed since the night Clara died. But when you were lying here, I did. I begged not for you to live for me, but for a chance to live because of you. He paused, swallowing hard. You're the only reason I can even imagine forgiving myself. Ella didn't answer right away. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't from sorrow. They were the kind that came when pain finally loosened its hold. She reached up, her fingertips brushing gently against his cheek. Gabriel, she whispered. He looked at her, and she asked quietly, Do you know why I believe in you? He shook his head. Because I don't see your mistakes, she said softly. I see the man who still dares to love, even after losing everything. He froze, her words sinking deep. His gray eyes shimmered, and for the first time, light reflected in them as though the storm inside had finally begun to clear. Dares to love, he repeated, the phrase fragile and reverent on his tongue. You think I still can? Not can, she said, smiling faintly. You already do. A tremulous smile touched his lips, awkward, unsteady, but real. the first in years. He bent down and pressed a trembling kiss to her hand. Thank you for coming back. She exhaled softly, her voice barely above the hum of the monitor. I never left, Gabriel. You just hadn't learned how to see me yet. They sat together for a long while, neither speaking. The light grew stronger, spilling across the bed, washing the exhaustion from their faces. Outside, the lavender fields swayed gently on the hillside, spreading their fragrance through the open window. Gabriel's grip on her hand tightened slightly, but not in fear this time, in promise. And Ella, though weak, returned the pressure, her fingers threading through his. No more guilt, no more silence. Only warmth, the warmth of return, of two souls who had finally found their way back from the dark. By late afternoon, when the doctor came to check on her again, he found them sitting just like that, hands entwined, sunlight wrapping around them. After he left, Gabriel leaned closer. You should rest, he murmured. Ella smiled, her eyes half closed. Do you hear it? He frowned lightly. Hear what? The rain. He paused. Then he heard it too, the faint tapping on the window pane. Gentle, rhythmic. But this rain was different. It didn't sound like grief anymore. It was the sound of life, of something renewed, delicate, and quietly miraculous. Gabriel brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his voice low but steady. This time, I'm not letting you go. Her lips curved into a sleepy smile. I know. Because this time, you've chosen to stay. Outside, the rain fell softly on the blooming lavender. Inside, they drifted into rest, peaceful, unafraid, as if the world itself had decided to give them one more chance to begin again. 3 months later, summer arrived in Boston, flooding the city with light. The streets shimmered under golden warmth, and the ground floor of the maple and glass art gallery was alive with people. The air carried the faint scent of paint and champagne, and the polished floor reflected the glow of the white gallery lights. For the first time, the world was seeing the works of Ella Monroe. The title of the exhibition was printed in elegant silver letters at the entrance, The Garden of Second Chances. Few among the visitors could imagine that every brushstroke in these paintings had been born out of a winter spent inside the quiet, haunted walls of the Hawthorne estate, the place where a woman had taught a broken man how to see light again, even in the heart of darkness. Guests moved slowly through the gallery, stopping to admire the paintings that seemed to breathe on the canvas. At the center of the main hall stood the largest piece, placed beneath a soft halo of light, Man in the Rainlight. It showed a man standing alone in the rain, his coat soaked through, but behind him, faint rays of sunlight streamed through the leaves, turning the downpour into silver threads. Ella stood quietly before it. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself not the uncertain woman who once arrived in Vermont searching for work, but someone who had walked through a storm and found the courage to paint her life anew. Behind her, a familiar voice spoke, low and steady. You turn my mistakes into art. Who gave you the right to do that? She turned. Gabriel stood there dressed in a gray suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before, the warmth of a man learning to live again. A small smile curved her lips. You did, she said softly, when you let me see the light you'd been hiding. He looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, and you made it more beautiful than I ever thought it could be. She laughed under her breath. That's because light doesn't come from perfection, Gabriel. It comes from the cracks. He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Cracks, huh? I have an entire wall of them. I know, she said, eyes glinting, but at least now it has a door. Halfway through the evening, the host's voice rose over the hum of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the artist herself, Miss Ella Monroe. Applause filled the room as Ella stepped onto the small stage, her dress catching the light. Cameras flashed and she smiled, radiant and calm. But before she could speak, someone else joined her. Gabriel. The room hushed at once. He approached her, holding a small velvet box in one hand. Ella froze, her heartbeat quickening as the crowd faded into a blur. He took the microphone, his voice imperfect, trembling slightly but full of truth. The contract between us, he began, expired a long time ago. Laughter rippled softly through the audience, but he didn't stop. But I don't want to go back to silence. He turned to her then, and the whole room seemed to disappear. His gaze held only hers. Let's write a new chapter not with clauses or signatures, but with our hearts. A collective breath caught. Gabriel opened the box. Inside, a simple ring gleamed a single lavender stone, the same hue as the flowers they had once planted together in the garden that saved them both. Ella's lips parted, but no words came. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over her cheeks like drops of glass. She nodded. Once, and that was enough. The applause erupted, warm and thunderous, like rain breaking against the windows after a long drought. That evening they returned to Hawthorne. The estate no longer looked like a tomb. The garden overflowed with color lavender, roses, white daisies, all swaying gently beneath the golden hour. Gabriel opened the old iron gate, the hinges creaking softly. Then he handed her a brush and a small tin of white paint. You once said you wanted to repaint this gate, he said. Ella smiled. And this time, I want you to help me. He chuckled quietly, dipping his brush. Together they painted, stroke by stroke, until the rusted metal gleamed again. The sun dipped low, laying its last light across her hair, across his shoulders. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Between them was something stronger than words: forgiveness, return, and the quiet joy of a love that had finally healed. When the last rays of light melted into evening, they sat side by side on the front steps, their hands streaked with white paint, their clothes smudged, and their laughter soft. The air was filled with the scent of lavender and the hum of cicadas. Gabriel turned to her, his voice gentle. I used to live in silence to hide from my pain. I know, she said, but then you came not to break the walls. He paused, his smile tender, but to help me open the door from within. Ella's fingers brushed his. That door, she said quietly, was yours to unlock. I only knocked. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries both peace and gratitude. And as twilight settled over Hawthorne, the old house no longer held shadows. There was only light, warm, forgiving, alive. In the heart of the garden they'd rebuilt together, two souls sat beneath the fading sky, proof that even from the darkest soil, something beautiful could bloom again.